In this video, I'd like to make an introduction to the Flashman series, sometimes referred to as the Flashman Papers. I'd like to give a brief introduction first, like a very brief summary of exactly what these books are, so you can gauge whether or not you're interested in continuing with the rest of the video. And then after I've covered it in brief, then I'll get into it in more depth. So the Flashman series is a book series, the premise of which is that Flashman is a very well-respected Victorian soldier, or he's a very well-respected soldier from the Victorian era, known for his bravery, his military feats, his chivalry. And after he died, his papers were discovered, his private papers, in which he wrote down the truth of what really happened. And it turned out that he was actually nothing like his public image. He was not brave, he was actually a coward. He was not chivalrous, he was actually a scoundrel. And he had somehow fooled everyone into thinking that he was really brave and really honorable this whole time. It takes place over 12 books, well, 12 books in the series proper, and then 2 tie-in books. The first book was written in 1969. The last book was written in 2005. The author unfortunately passed away in 2008, so the series is now over. There will be no new Flashman books. So all the way from 1969 to 2005, but the bulk of these books were written in the 1970s. And after the 1970s, the pace of these books slowed down a little bit, with them coming out more sporadically. The genre of these books is historical fiction. And specifically, it's mostly targeting the British Empire in the 19th century. So each of these books will cover a different aspect of the British Empire. One is the British Empire in Afghanistan, one is the British Empire in India, one is the British Empire in the Punjab with the Sikh War, one is the British Empire in China with the Arrow War, also known as the Second Opium War. One is the British Empire in Ethiopia, British Army in South Africa with the Zulu War. One is about James Brooke, who was not officially with the British Army. He was a private British citizen who established his own state in Borneo, what is now modern-day Malaysia. One book is about the British Empire and the Crimean War, etc. Although not every book is strictly focused on the British Empire. 3 of the books are actually about America. One of the books is about the Underground Railroad. One book is about John Brown and the raid on Harper's Ferry. One book is about Custer's Last Stand. It also covers Madagascar in the 19th century, Congress of Berlin, and some of the politics of Europe. But yeah, the type of person who would be interested in these books is somebody who is interested in history. You'd have to be interested in historical fiction, preferably the 19th century Victorian era British Empire. Because, I mean, maybe you got the sense of this already from the introduction to the premise of this series, about a scoundrel and a coward who manages to pass himself off as a hero. It's somewhat of a dark humor, ironic take. I mean, they're humorous, but it's not like laugh-out-loud slapstick type humor most of the time, although it does have its moments. It's more of a dark irony kind of covering the whole series. So you'd want to be up for that if you're going to tackle this series. Now, this series has been very popular in Britain. The author is British. The series was originally published in Britain. I think it's somewhat less popular, but still fairly popular in the Commonwealth countries like Canada, Australia, New Zealand. It is, in my experience, almost completely unheard of in America. Or that is to say, I as an American never heard of it until I encountered some British friends. Although I have to be a little bit careful about overgeneralizing from my own personal experiences. I mean, maybe I just hung out with the wrong crowd, or maybe the library in my particular town just didn't carry these books, or, you know, maybe I just didn't encounter them for one reason or another. But that's definitely my impression, is that they're very popular in Britain, not so popular in America. But by all means, let me know what your experience is. If you're an American, did you hear about these books at all? How did you hear about them? Or, you know, whichever country you're from, let me know which country you're from and how popular these books are in your own country, or how you happen to hear about them. In my own experience, I'm an American myself, but I've been living abroad for almost 20 years now. I was teaching English in Japan, in which I hung out with the expatriate crowd, which was not only Americans, but Australians, New Zealanders, and Brits, people from England and Scotland, etc. And it was a British friend of mine who introduced me to this series. We were talking about history one day, and he said, I think you would really like this series. I also had another really good British friend when I was teaching English in Cambodia, who was also a huge fan of this series, and I was already reading it by the time I met him. But he and I spent a lot of time talking about this series over beers and how great it was. When I was living in Australia, I found that I had easy access to this series. So I was living in Melbourne, Australia, round about the time I started reading this series. Sorry, exactly about the time I started reading this series. And if you go into a bookstore in Melbourne, Australia, you can find the whole series prominently displayed in the bookstore, very easy to find. So it was very easy to just start at book one and start reading through these. Now, the intent of this video is to make a Flashman for beginners video to introduce the series to somebody who has no idea about it. Presumably maybe my fellow Americans. Somebody from America who's never heard of this series before, even though it's been very popular in Britain, and I'm just going to try, the goal of this video is going to walk you through it, kind of starting at the very beginning, and then giving you a brief overview of the series. There will be some spoilers coming ahead, and in my opinion, these particular spoilers aren't going to spoil the experience of the book, but there will be some spoilers. A couple other disclaimers I just want to get out of the way quickly. This is somewhat connected to what I call my scripted review series, in which I go back and read book reviews that I wrote on the weblog 10 years ago. 10 years ago was actually the time I started reading these Flashman series, when I was in Australia in 2010. So I'm going off, I've gone back and I've reread my old reviews to refresh my memory, but I am going off of a 10-year-old memory here in this case. So if I get anything wrong, or if I misremember anything, apologies in advance. Just correct me down in the comments. Let me know what I got wrong. I'm fairly confident I'm going to remember most of this right. The other disclaimer is, this ties into the previous disclaimer. After I film this video, I'm going to, in the next few days or weeks, continue on through my scripted review series, which means I'll be making reviews of the individual books in the series as individual reviews. And in doing so, I'm going to repeat a lot of the same information that I'm giving out here, because the information here is drawn from the same reviews that I'll be subsequently filming. So you may not want to watch both. If you watch this introduction video, then maybe don't watch my other videos in the Flashman series, because I'll just be giving out a lot of the same information. Or if you've already watched some of my other videos in the Flashman series, this is assuming sometime in the future after I've already made those videos, maybe don't watch this one. Or do what you like. I don't care. Anyways, the origin of Flashman. So Flashman actually, before the 1969 book in the Flashman series, he originated as a character in a classic 19th century novel. So he's like a public domain character that somebody just took and made into their own series. So the novel he originated from was a novel published in 1857 by Thomas Hughes, which is called Tom Brown's School Days. It was published in 1857, but it takes place in takes place between 1834 and 1842, which was when Thomas Hughes himself was a schoolboy. So the book is supposedly semi-autobiographical. I think when it came out, people accused Tom Hughes of making an autobiographical book, and then he said, no, I'm nothing like Tom Brown. I was never as good as he is portrayed as. But a lot of it presumably does come from his real-life experience as a schoolboy during this time. Thomas Hughes went to a place called Rugby School. Now, if you're unfamiliar with Rugby School, that is, if you're an American like me, you think, rugby? Isn't that the name of the sport? Well, this is the school where that sport gets its name from. It's like an old, famous English boarding school. Thomas Hughes actually went there from 1834 to 1842, and then in the novel, Tom Brown is going to the school during that same period. And what's a little bit interesting about this book is that not only is Rugby School a real place, but some real people are written into this novel, like Thomas Arnold, who was a headmaster of the School of Rugby during that time, is written into as a character into the Tom Brown School Days novel. So it's incorporating fictionalized elements with real-life people who were there at the time, which is somewhat setting the stage for what George MacDonald Fraser is going to do later with the Flashman character. But I'm getting slightly ahead of myself. This novel was very influential in the 19th century, especially in Britain, and according to Wikipedia, bizarrely enough, it was also very influential in Japan. I think it was somewhat popular in the United States back in its day. Apparently, President Ulysses S. Grant was a huge fan of this book. But I think it's been completely forgotten about in America nowadays. Again, that's been my experience. Let me know if your experience was different, if you're an American watching this. But I never heard of it. I think in America it's been completely forgotten about. I think in Britain it's still fairly popular, or it's still largely known. According to Wikipedia, it's been adapted for film and television a number of times in Britain. Some of it pretty old, going back to the 1940s, but some of it more recent. I think there was a 2005 TV movie made about this book in Britain. So I get the impression that it's still being read and is still known in Britain. I've also noticed, again in my interactions with British people, that some of them will use Tom Brown's School Days, like the title of the novel, as just a shorthand for describing the brutal experiences of boarding school. Again, my British friend in Cambodia, when he was talking about going to boarding school and how all the older boys would pick on the younger boys, he would say, it was just like Tom Brown's School Days. Since I've read this book, have you ever had it where after you've read something you notice it popping up? Like you never heard about it before and then you become aware of it and then you notice it every place? That's exactly what happened to me with this book. After I became aware of it and after I read it, I noticed it popping up all over the place. And I've noticed British authors like Seaman Sebag Montefiore. He's a British author. He wrote a book called Young Stalin, in which he talked about Stalin's school days, and he compared it to Tom Brown's School Days. So I think this book does still have currency in Britain, is what I'm trying to say. Anyway, the premise of this book, it's about a young man named Tom Brown who starts boarding school, at Rugby boarding school. He makes a friend, Harry East, nicknamed Scud, because he's quick on his feet. I guess that's what Scud meant back in those days. And he has all the experiences of boarding school, including getting bullied by the older boys and learning to stand up to the bullies. The book is heavy on the moralizing in tone. So it's kind of setting up Tom Brown as an ideal character to be emulated of sorts, although it was not the same sort of moralizing that I remember receiving from my teachers and my Sunday school teachers, which was largely just sit down, be quiet, don't cause trouble. If there's any sort of fight on the schoolyard, don't try and solve it yourself. Go get a teacher. I mean, that was my school day experiences. That's what my teachers tried to get us to do. The morality in this book is a little bit different. Maybe this is more of a 19th century British bulldog morality, or the code of the schoolyard, which is never pick on boys that are smaller than you. But if somebody bullies you who is bigger than you, then don't be afraid to stand up to them. Never start a fight, but never shirk from a fight if challenged. Always throw yourself into sports completely. Don't worry about your own physical safety or getting injured. A certain amount of mischief is natural and healthy for young boys, but if you get caught, don't lie about it. Just be honest and fess up and tell the truth. That seems to be the morality which is advocated in Tom Brown's school days. Except for the second half of the book, which takes a rather bizarre turn when they find religion. And then the second half of the book is taken up with the characters in Bible study and talking about religion and God and the Bible. It's a rather bizarre tonal shift in the second half of the book. And in fact, P.J. Wodehouse, the British humorist, he's most famous for his Wooster and Jeeves series. He's a famous British humorist at any rate. He wrote a satirical essay called The Tom Brown Question, in which he imagined that Thomas Hughes had written the first half of the book, and then all of a sudden the second half of the book gets hijacked by a moralizing committee, and that accounts for the bizarre tone shift. Yeah, I don't know. Whatever the case, Flashman is from the book Tom Brown's School Days, and Flashman is the bully in this book. So George MacDonald Fraser, about 100 years later, took Flashman from the Tom Brown School Days book and made a whole series out of Flashman, who had been the bully character in the Tom Brown School Days books. For comparison, maybe this is an analogy that will make a little bit more sense to a 20th century American audience, 21st century American audience. Imagine if, like 150 years in the future, somebody writes a series of books called the Malfoy Chronicles, in which Malfoy, the bully character from Harry Potter, after he finishes Hogwarts, goes off and has all his own adventures, in which he's a complete scoundrel, as you would expect from his portrayal in the Harry Potter books, but he somehow manages to trick everyone into thinking he's really great, and they make it into a historical fiction series, so he's at all the key points of history in the 21st century. So I don't know, he's has a key part in the 9/11 events, and he's got a key part in the Iraq War, and he's got a key part in the Tea Party movement, key part in Brexit, or you know, whatever the big events of the 21st century turn out to be. In this book, the Malfoy Chronicles, he's got a key part in all of them. If you can imagine that, that's kind of what the Flashman series is by analogy. Although that analogy may be perhaps a little bit too on the nose, because, again, according to Wikipedia, the Harry Potter series, or at least the first book in the Harry Potter series, is heavily modeled on Tom Brown's School Days. So J.K. Rowling was using Tom Brown's School Days as an inspiration and a model in part for Hogwarts and the boarding school at Hogwarts. Which probably explains the character of Malfoy, maybe patterned after the character of Flashman a bit. Anyways, Flashman's qualities. In the book Tom Brown's School Days, he's pretty much the antithesis of everything that Tom Brown is, or everything that the book is setting up as a good moral character. So he delights in tormenting the younger boys, the boys who are too small to fight back with him. And he appears to be a bit of a sadist. He delights in tormenting them just for the sake of watching them be tormented. On the other hand, though, the boys older than him, they use a term toady, which I think is a 19th century British term, but it means like he's a bit of a suck-up, I guess, might be the translation into American English. He's a toady or suck-up to the older boys. He's always doing everything he can to make them happy and to do everything they want. When the younger boys, Tom Brown and his friends, eventually get the courage to stand up and try and fight back to Flashman, then as soon as he sees them fighting back, he just turns around and runs. So he's got absolutely no stomach for confronting anyone who tries to fight back with him. He's only interested in tormenting people who won't fight back. He completely dominates the second quarter of the book. And then he gets expelled. He gets caught drunk and he gets expelled from the school, and then he's just done. And then the second half of the book doesn't have anything to do with him. Now, the entire character of Flashman, and a lot of the minor characters in the Flashman series, comes directly out of this Tom Brown School Days book. So, you do kind of need to read this if you want to get into the Flashman series. And I say that with a little bit of caution because it is an 1857 Victorian era book, which is, it's a bit of a slog, to be honest. It's a bit slow going. It's not the most exciting book in the world. But if you're the type of person who is watching this video, you know, somebody who's on BookTube and interested in reading books and becoming literate, then maybe you're enough of a nerd that you, like me, you would think to yourself, well, okay, it's a classic book. You know, one more classic under my belt. I can talk about this with my friends at cocktail parties and brag about how well read I am, or I don't know. That's the way I viewed it. I thought, oh, what the heck, it's a classic. I'll just slog my way through it. Yeah, once you've read this, the first Flashman book picks up immediately where Tom Brown's School Days finishes. That is, sorry, not where Tom Brown's School Days finishes, but where Flashman's character arc finishes. That is, he's getting expelled from he's getting expelled from school at the very beginning of the Flashman book. A lot of the characters from the Tom Brown School Days also pop up in the Flashman books, in the early Flashman books especially. And by early, I mean the first 6. So Tom Brown himself pops up as a character in one of the Flashman books. Scud East, Tom Brown's best friend, figures as a major character in 2 of the Flashman books. Speedy Cut, who was kind of Flashman's friend or Flashman's fellow bully, pops up in the books. There's all sorts of references back to the Tom Brown School Days. So it's worth reading before you tackle the Flashman series. You won't get half the references otherwise. And also, there's some very interesting meta stuff going on in the Flashman book. Like in the very first book, right off the bat, he's complaining about how he's been portrayed by Thomas Hughes in Tom Brown's School Days. Says, yes, I know you've already read Tom Brown's School Days by Thomas Hughes and how he portrayed me. And then as the book continues, as the Flashman series continues on in chronology, eventually you get to the point, 1857, when Tom Brown's School Days was actually published. And then there's some stuff, this reminds me of Don Quixote, where in part 2 of Don Quixote is actually reading about himself in part 1. By the time you get to 1857 in the Flashman series, Tom Brown's School Days has been published by Thomas Hughes, and then Flashman can read through the book and read about how he's portrayed. And then in the subsequent books, occasionally this will pop up. Other characters will ask him about it. They will say, is it true what Thomas Hughes said about you in Tom Brown's School Days? And just some, I don't know, some clever, maybe meta stuff there. I thought I thought it was cute. It gets interesting. So anyways, that's where Flashman comes from. He comes from this 1857 book, and then in 1969, George MacDonald Fraser decided to take this character from this public domain book and make his own series out of it. And again, this series is historical fiction, and it imagines that Flashman was at all the key points of history in the 19th century. And the premise behind the book is that Flashman's papers have been unearthed. They've been discovered. And George MacDonald Fraser pretends he's the editor of these books. So you have the papers, and then you have all these notes, endnotes. So you'll be reading along the story, and then you'll see the number 1. And you flip to the back of the book, and then there's a comment by George MacDonald Fraser, who's pretending he's editing these papers. So he's pretending he's republishing them exactly as he found them, but then he's making his editor's comments on the back of the book. And if you're a history nerd, and you would be if you're reading these books, because there's no reason to read them unless you're a huge history nerd, the endnotes are the real treat for these books. Because as you go through, Flashman is telling his story, and then as you go through and you read the endnotes, George MacDonald Fraser is commenting on the historical accuracy of what Flashman is telling you. So, for example, George MacDonald Fraser will say, yes, this really happened, this event happened just as Flashman witnessed it. Here's the source where you can read more about it. This was a real historical person that Flashman saw, etc., etc. It's historical fiction with a copious amount of endnotes, which kind of fleshes out the history more. These books, again, widely popular in Britain and then the Commonwealth countries, may be considered classics. I don't have it here, well, sorry. When I was in Australia, in a bookstore, I discovered these books were being printed as part of the Everyman's Classic Library. I think they called it the Everyman's Contemporary Classic. This isn't the book. Sorry, this is a completely different book. But this is the sort of way it was published, with this kind of very classic little binding like this. And it's an Everyman's Classic. And they published 3 of the Flashman books together. Flashman, the first one, Flash for Freedom, and Flashman and the Great Game, which they published as Everyman Contemporary Classics. So, are these books classics? Well, I don't know. This gets into the whole debate of what's a classic and what's not, and how old does it need to be. They certainly don't read like classics. They read like very irreverent, pulpy type fun books. The first one was published in 1969, so is that old enough to be considered a classic nowadays? Maybe a modern classic, which I think is how Everyman classifies it in their library. Yeah, again, they had a large cultural impact in Britain, and they're very well known then. The books I bought and read were the ones published by HarperCollins. So it's been through a few different editions and a few different reprintings. But in 2005, I think HarperCollins reprinted them with new artwork on the front to make it a little bit more appealing for modern audiences. I think the old artwork was starting to look a little bit dated. And most of the books in this series picture Flashman up on the cover of the book, usually with an exotic woman next to him, which